to share in the midst of our struggle allows people to actually see God working in the midst of those things. I think that's a glorious thing.
Welcome to Footnotes, a behind-the-scenes look at what we value and why it matters here at Foothill Church in Glendora, California. My name is Stephen Coppenrath. I'm one of the pastors on staff, and I am your host. I oftentimes say some of my guests the last few months have been my favorite people, but this week I have the joy and honor to actually hang with literally my favorite person, Katie May Coppenrath, my lovely wife. Thanks for being here, babe.
I'm glad to be here.
I'm excited to pick up on a conversation that we've really been having on and off now for years in our home. And it's actually been about a year now since I've actually got to share some of that with our church even. So, which we'll actually leave that sermon from last fall in the show notes if you all are interested. But we're talking, of course, about depression and anxiety, and especially during some of these holiday months. But before we get into all of that, I'd love to have everyone just get to know you a little bit more. So for our Footnotes listeners, Katie, please tell us a little bit more about yourself and how you spend your days.
Well, hi, listeners. I am glad to be here. I'm honest, I'm a little bit nervous.
That's okay.
You all talk professionally for a living.
I wouldn't say that, but something like that.
I spend my days, with the 10 and under crowd these days anyway. So this season actually looks really different for me than it did a year ago. As you know, it was almost a year ago when the Lord really pressed on us for me to be able to stay home with our 4 kiddos. Events unfolded and here I am, full-time stay-at-home mom.
Yeah, that's awesome. What's the last few months been like, just even with school and stuff for us?
It's been hard work. Mm-hmm. We have 3 kids in school. Owen is 10, Penny is 8. Margot just turned 6, is in kindergarten. And then we have our little family mascot, Wesley, who's 4. And so we do some online school. We have been working together with some friends to make that happen.
That's been a blessing.
It has been a blessing. Yeah. 2 days a week, I have 9 kids at the house doing online school, which is an adventure all in itself, even though there's been some transition from working even part-time to staying home full-time. Just really grateful that the Lord saw it fit for me to do this in this season and to be able to steward that time really well, even though in my head a year ago, the thoughts of staying home look really different than reality.
Sure. Yeah. This year hasn't quite matched up with our expectations in lots of ways. You're doing a great job spinning all those plates.
Thank you.
We've been married for 16 years and
yes.
We've been actually, I guess, going out. That's what we used to call it in the 90s anyway.
Yeah.
Since about 1998. So about 22 years been together. And that's actually relevant somewhat to, I think, to our chat today, because this would really apply to really any of you listening who have a friend or a spouse or just someone you've kind of grown up with and really have seen one another on, the best day of your life and the worst day too, right?
Yeah, good, bad, ugly, uglier.
Sure.
It's been great to grow up with you in that way. And I was even thinking back, as we come upon our 22-year dating anniversary next week.
November 27th. Yep.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah,
you know it.
Uh-huh.
Just how, our infatuation with each other as 16-year-olds and how that's grown into like a really deeper love as we worked on that in our marriage, and just seeing God's grace in that over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think the Lord has really allowed us to serve as even a mirror to see ourselves more clearly over the years, for sure. And so this topic of depression is, I'm sure, much more of an issue that people would admit for maybe some of you listening. But Katie, maybe just give us a brief history, whatever you're comfortable with, about how you kind of come to realize this was something that was a part of your life kind of every day.
Well, I think, historically in my family, there was a lot of unrecognized or undiagnosed depression with some of my family members, which marked, some things growing up. And in retrospect, there were probably some signs in my adolescence and high school years of depression. But again, it just was not something that my family really recognized or dealt with really well. And it wasn't until my junior year of college when I actually was diagnosed as having a major depressive episode.
Okay. By a psychologist.
Right.
Right.
So what that looked like in that season was just some deep sadness, physical inability to do simple things like get out of bed and take a shower and go to class. And that led to some anxiety because when I wouldn't go to class and I wouldn't write my papers, it turned into almost this paralyzing fear. I remember that real practically what that looked like was, if I could get myself out of bed in that season, walking towards class and then just stopping and not even being able to physically move my feet.
Yeah.
Because I've, the things that I thought were ahead of me and the failure that I thought I was facing. Kind of dealing with that with some help of counselors on campus and then psychiatrists prescribing medication kind of brought me out of that season.
So that was helpful in that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I don't know, what the rest of my college experience would have looked like without, taking those action steps. And that took people around me helping me, like you, I'm sure very clearly remember.
I was very helpful. Yeah.
But you were just keeping me accountable to going to my counseling appointments and encouraging me in that way. I remember, the people around me really trying to encourage me and bring me out of that, but I was so numb to anything that people were saying or doing. So it really took that medication to bring me out of that mental state.
Okay, so how has that changed for you then over the years? I mean, just obviously we got married in 2004, went on into full-time ministry after that, starting having kids. How is that kind of, your journey with depression really running parallel with that?
Well, I was on medication for about 5 or 6 years, up until we kind of decided it was time to have kids, and the medication I was on was not really conducive to having healthy pregnancies. So we went off that, I think fearfully, I'm sure at first, but by God's grace, I didn't have another major episode like I had in college. There are for sure days that maybe even turned into weeks where that depression would creep back in. But I, again, by God's grace, never really struggled with postpartum depression or things that I know are very prevalent, even with people in our community and people listening. But that's not to say, again, there were still some bad days, but we never really did anything. I never took action steps to fight against that or overcome that. I kind of just rode those waves over the next 8 years or so. And then about 2 years ago, kind of around this time of year, another season of depression kind of hit me. And it was unlike any other kind of season that had happened before. Even as it crept in, I was very aware that it was different, and I could sense that God was going to do something different in this particular kind of wave of depression. And so it was, if you remember, trying to make those decisions about what was going to be best for us and our family, because it was different than any other season before, and just felt that prompting from the Lord to do something and start this journey of figuring out really what this depression was. So I started counseling with Steve Dobrinsky, and I signed up for Steps, and God really used that. It ended up being about 4 months of being depressed to do some sanctifying work in me. And you've said this before, and Steve Dobrinsky has even talked about this on his podcast about a month ago, that depression or any mental illness, while is a result of original sin, isn't necessarily caused by or triggered by personal sin.
Right.
But I think that in that season for me, while that was all very true, God really used that depression as a catalyst to bring some sin to the surface for me. Things, my idols of control and idealism and, carrying the burden of other people's happiness that really, when I enter into depression, keep me down. So working through some of those things by taking action through that season of depression.
One of the things we discuss often is just between Katie and I, even our comfortability with sharing and being vulnerable. I think I realized just being in ministry, part of being a good leader is to be honest about where you're at personally. And, I've always admired that about you and how you have just no arrogance or ego about your story. You're always leading the way for us in our marriage and vulnerability, and you do that with so much grace. And so sometimes I'm even caught off guard by it, and even sometimes wish you wouldn't share things, but I'm so glad you do. And so, where do you kind of feel that comes from? How have you always been, this comfortable sharing in your own skin?
You say that, but if I'm honest, there is a struggle to admit where you're weak, admit that you need help. So first and foremost, I think it's God's grace on me and in my life, and not just giving me the courage, but the knowledge, that His work on the cross frees me from shame, and really embracing that freedom. I think it's an act of spiritual discipline for me. The Bible talks a lot about bringing things from the dark into the light, and to practice not only confessing sin and saying it out loud, but practicing bringing those things that I know are lies, or things that admittedly are weaknesses, out of the dark, gives them less power over me. And it's something that I have to do so that when the days are dark, or that depression or that darkness creeps in, it has less power over me by saying it out loud.
Yeah.
And I think even most importantly, when we share our struggles and share our weaknesses, it allows God's glory to be seen more clearly.
Yeah, absolutely.
We can in retrospect share our stories and say, this is where I was, and now you see where I am now. But to share in the midst of our struggle allows people to actually see God working in the midst of those things. I think that's a glorious thing. It's not an easy task to raise your hand and say, God, I want to be used by you in this way. But I see His glory. And if I really believe when I say, like, God, use me in any way you want, then I have to be willing to be that vessel for His glory to be seen.
It's really safe and almost calculated to, share how God brought you out of something back in college or 10 years ago, or kind of share a sermon illustration, or just some example. God taught us this important thing way back when. But something that even brings us to the podcast today is depression isn't something that's over and done with for you. It's still something that pops up in your head in the present.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my season that I walked through 2 years ago and going through that counseling, and I finished that, and God very much answered my prayer in bringing me through that journey very rapidly, actually. But that doesn't mean that I still don't struggle, especially in the season of COVID.
Yeah.
There's been days and even weeks when that struggle of depression is really apparent. Pragmatically, what that looks like for me is just waking up and immediately knowing what kind of day it's going to be. And those days, my struggle is really a temptation to despair. I know depression looks different for everybody. Even in different seasons, it looks different for me. But on those days when I feel that kind of numbness creeping in, it's not because I'm not feeling. I think it's because I'm truly fighting in my mind every single thought. All I want to do is get back in bed and not face my reality, even though my reality is good comparatively. But it's just these lies and these emotions that are louder, and I feel them more strongly than what's actually true and what's actually real. So, yeah, by God's grace, today is a good day. Yeah. Tomorrow might not be. And being able to accept that and say that out loud actually has been really significant in this past season for me. Significant because in calling it what it is and accepting it for what it is, I've been able to see God in a greater way. A few years ago, Pastor Chris talked about this poem called The Thorn. It's by Snell Nicholson. And in it, she talks about how she asks God for a gift, and instead he hands her a thorn. And she talks about the pain that it comes with it and questions, God, why would you give this to me? And after years of having it, she realizes it's only because of this thorn that she can pin back the veil in order to see God's face more clearly. Mm-hmm. And God is showing me that that's what depression is in my life. It's that thorn. It's that Paul talks about it too in 2 Corinthians. Just it's something that seems like you want healing, you want victory from, but in having it, there are gifts beyond measure.
You mentioned a couple times just by God's grace. And I think it's a really powerful and important thing. It's more than just kind of just a saying even too. And I've, sat front row to that. Kind of flesh that out a little bit more. What seems to consistently bring you back to level? How is God helping you manage this? How is God's grace kind of evident in this?
I think if I didn't struggle with depression, I wouldn't know scripture like I do today. I really believe that it is the best weapon when it comes to taking thoughts captive or fighting against, the lies of our enemy. And so having that at the ready has been so key. And I don't necessarily think it stops it from coming on. It might shorten the span and when those seasons do come or those days do come, but for sure it helps me be okay in the midst of it. It helps me be able to say like, hey, I'm struggling, but I'm okay because I have the truth of God's scripture at hand, and I can discern what is real, what is true, apart from what are the lies that are keeping me down.
All right. Well, as we kind of wind this down a little bit, just even practically speaking, I think, I'm 100% sure actually that there are many people in our church community who are dealing with these exact battles every day, but they don't know where to start. They don't know how to, reach out for help. What's a practical starting line for a Christian dealing with these thoughts?
Yeah, I think like I kind of just mentioned, the spiritual discipline of knowing scripture, reading scripture, meditating on scripture has been so key in my struggle, the days that I struggle. It's like the Bible talks about, we have to be at the ready for when the trials and tribulations come. What that looks like for me, I really struggle actually with memorizing scripture. I've tried. I barely can memorize worship songs. So I write it down, and I know which scriptures are really powerful for me in those moments. John 16:33 says we will face tribulation, but to take heart because Jesus has overcome the world. Lamentations 3, Psalm 42, just having them written down. And so when those days come, I can pull them out and I can read them and I can have them with me, have them at hand, making sure that I have rhythms of exercise and rest and being outside, getting some vitamin D one way or another, I know is really helpful for me. And then telling somebody, I think like I mentioned earlier, bringing things out of darkness into light when those days come, just to be able to say, hey, I'm really struggling. I'm okay, but I'm really struggling. And just telling someone, I tell you, yeah. But there's that phone number for the church you can text, and just even knowing that people are praying for me, even though when they tangibly can't fix what I'm going through, even when they can't take on the burden. But again, just saying it out loud and letting someone else know is really important. I think something that we are called to in anything that we struggle with. Steve talked about some really great ways back on his podcast he did about a month ago. So I encourage people to go back to that and listen to that, because he really laid out some other practical ways. And if I can say this, it's about preparation. It's much more difficult to endure and persevere through those seasons of depression if you don't have these tools at the ready So to do these things, prepare these things, get in these rhythms and habits in the good days, and not just, let your guard down, but to really take these action steps when you are thinking clearly and physically able to get these things in place, so that when those hard days come, I've personally experienced they've been not as hard, and over a little bit quicker. But I mean, you've been alongside this with me. What's been successful in your eyes? I mean, what are some things that you've done to help or not help in the past?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that anybody's dealing with depression, and I would say this goes both ways for me too. I mean, I'm not impervious to feeling low and discouraged, especially during this last year. And so there's been times where you've had to play that role too, and hold my arms up and encourage me. You mentioned some of these things already, but if you are a friend or a spouse or somebody who is in the life of somebody who deals with depression on a regular basis, I think it's really just important to offer that gift of presence, to be able to be someone who's safe. Kate even mentioned, waking up and saying, hey, this is kind of the day I feel like we may have. And kind of nodding your head and giving you a hug and saying, okay, we're in this together. And I think being present in that moment, hearing and listening well. And then I think what maybe not to do as well, this is kind of an obvious one, but don't try and necessarily feel like we have to, fix things for you that day and kind of make things easier. I mean, obviously we want to serve one another and bring that to the table for sure, but there's not something that on the surface will fix what's happening below the surface in the heart. And as you just mentioned, I mean, God is working underneath the surface in all those areas. And so in some ways, I think one of the best ways we can do as a supporter is to encourage that spiritual growth to happen. Encourage, hey, tell me about a passage you're reading lately, or what's a verse that would combat how you're feeling today, and kind of pointing someone back to the truth, as opposed to just simply saying, hey, it's not that bad, or hey, think about all the great stuff that's going on today, or that's obviously not the heart of the issue. So yeah, I mean, we're still learning on how to do this, and this is something that's will continue to be. Hopefully I'll have better answers for you in 20 years as we walk through this together.
Yeah, as I think about walking into this holiday season, or this season that is typically higher for that seasonal depression, I think something that people can do is try to figure out what are those triggers. Is it family gatherings? Is it maybe some past hurts that they haven't fleshed out yet? Maybe it is just that lack of vitamin D. The days are shorter, the mornings and nights seem darker, so really figuring out for yourself, what is it that could trigger these annual bouts of depression, and then bringing them to God. Again, that like bringing it into the light will give it less power over you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the same line of thinking, as far as just practical things, some people like to add resources to their library as well. Just kind of last question for you. What's a book or a podcast that could be helpful for someone who wants to just learn more about how to deal with this practically?
This year I read the book Get Out of Your Head by Jennie Allen, and it's been really a great tool for me, just in thinking about how to battle the battle in our minds, that taking your thoughts captive. She also has a podcast called Made for This, where I think it was the last season or the season before, she kind of walked through some principles of the book, and just a super helpful resource. She's very grounded. Everything is founded on biblical truth. So I would encourage, anyone to read that, and read it with somebody, where you can stop and talk about these principles that she lays out for you, and how they can help you in your battle really against anything.
Awesome. Well, it may not be a big deal for you, but thank you so much for opening up and sharing where God has helped you in this area in your life. I obviously, I so appreciate your willingness to put yourself out there and serve the church in this way and to share your story. And I'm sure that story connects with many people who are listening. I also just want to say, if you are listening and you realize that this is something that is a hardship for you, and you're realizing more and more that this is kind of the way that you're wired a little bit even, I would encourage you just to reach out to our staff. We would love to pray for you. We'd love to know that. We'd love to be able to support you, especially this year as we're all going through hard things. Katie mentioned the number already, but text us at 626-469-7070. Let us know so we can be praying for you and maybe even connecting you to a counselor in the area. Thanks for your time, babe. Thanks for sharing your wisdom. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for letting me come on and share. It's really an honor and a privilege to share what God has been doing.
All right, well, we're out of time, but thanks for joining us for our podcast, Footnotes. Be sure to subscribe, and we'd also appreciate you sharing this resource with others and even leaving us a favorable review if you feel so inclined. So until next time, Foothill, peace be with you.
Thank you for letting me word vomit on your podcast.
Don't say that.